everyone. I hope you all had some lunch and got a chance to walk around. I know I needed to. We have Will Panting here from DGI, and Will's the technical lead for the Islandora Migrate project, which is a Drush tool set to facilitate migration from legacy to modern. Will?
Yeah. Hello, folks. As introduced, I'm William Panting. I go by Will. I'm the development team lead at Discovery Garden. And I'd like to talk to you today about migration processes, because the technology is only actually a small part of it, isn't it? There's a whole lot of other expertise and work that goes into it. So we had previously did a usage demo of this during the May Open meeting of the Islandora Foundation. And once these slides are public, you can grab the links here. There's a handy demo module there. There's a slide deck and a recording of it that was made that can get you through actually trying to use the software that will be embedded in this process here that I'll be talking about. So, projects and processes. I'd like to just put what I'll be talking about in its proper context here. We use Agile at Discovery Garden. And we work in an iterative fashion, and we have all the general reviews and assurances that you'd expect during those kinds of processes. In particular, with complex things like migrations, we have discovery phases and hardening phases embedded in the projects, and we try and map those out where they'll be and how they'll be behaving before we start the project, so everyone can be on the same page. And when it comes to the tech stack that we've used for migrations, we've really tried to use existing tools, largely so that we can rely on expertise that other folks in various communities have. So there's a growing group of Drupal migrate experts out there. As Drupal ramps up its migrations from Drupal 7 into modern Drupal, we're doing the same thing, going from legacy Islandora to whatever we're calling it these days, Islandora 2 or modern Islandora. So we'll be able to rely on those folks as we need to as a community. It's one of the promises of the new stack. So the process I'll be going through, while I'll be talking about it pretty consistently in the vein of migrating from Islandora 7 into modern Islandora, this process as a process is really source independent, which means that the same process will work regardless of what your source data store is, whether it's legacy Islandora or something else like Archive Medica. So before I get started, I'd like to give some kudos. The process that you're about to see has been developed by the entire team at Discovery Garden. It was really collaborative and cross-disciplinary. I'm going to be mentioning Chris's name a lot during this presentation, so really bombard him with any questions you have afterwards. Maybe Luke too. It's also a work in progress. No process should ever be finished. Continuous improvement's pretty key. And I'll be talking about some of the lessons we've learned in the first few times we've gone through, and how we're going to incorporate that in improvements going forward, both technical and in process side. Alright, so I'll get right into it. There's some pre-flight things before you even start talking about your project with your team that you might want to make sure you have lined up, and that's access to all the appropriate systems. And that sounds simple, but it's not always simple to get. There's usually a few stakeholders involved, maybe even a few different vendors to get all your access straightened out from. And it can take a surprising amount of time, so it's really important to try and get that started as soon as you can. So you want to get to make sure you have access to the existing systems and to the new systems, and sort out any VPNs that you need for the project. And a little less obvious there is system and application documentation. Sometimes the stuff isn't public and may even be proprietary, but making sure that's in the hands of the people that need to refer to it can really save some cycles. But it can be just as hard to get as that access, so it's good to start trying to get your hands on that early. And in the modern world here of cloud computing, it's pretty important to understand what sort of data sovereignty issues might be in your project. Get that ironed out at the beginning so you don't make any missteps. And then there's the repo freeze. As a developer, I'll often be asking for a freeze on the repo, and it's stopping all the ingests and modifications pretty much as soon as I can get it. But that's not always practical. You know, you've got data that you want to get into your system, even while you're trying to migrate. That's pretty common. But it comes down to risk management rather than a one-size-fits-all. You can decide at what phase of your project you're going to make that pause and how much of a risk you're willing to take. So if you have super normalized data going into your system, you might be safe holding off on that repo freeze until pretty late in the migration process when you're just about to run that migration. But if you have data coming in from lots of sources that looks very different, you might want to put a pause on it earlier on before you do any of your analysis on your data and your metadata. So there's a bit of a spectrum there. But they're all things to try and get sorted before you even start. So what I got up here is a bit of the roadmap definition for the project template that we use. It's got 6 different phases there. They're not entirely linear, but that will, if you run them as if they are, things will run easier. So we have data prep, and in there you're really trying to understand what makes up your data, and the metadata prep, which is the same but different. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And system prep. And this is where you get to bug Luke afterwards. Migrations tend to be very computationally expensive operations. You might be moving terabytes of data around, creating millions of database rows, processing millions of XML files. All of these can be really expensive, and it's important to make sure that all the services you need have all the appropriate systems resources. And a bit of pre-planning here can really prevent a lot of issues. You can imagine if you're halfway through running a migration, suddenly you're out of memory, there might be some recovery necessary there, and it could set you back weeks, all things depending. And then there's migration development. So one thing I'd like to point out here is that it is 1 out of 6 of these items here is migration development, actually writing the code that will run the migration. Yeah, and then running the migration, where we actually take it up to the production machine and get her going. And migration cleanup. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, as you're doing a migration, you might find some metadata cleanup that you'd like to do, or even some data cleanup you'd like to do. A lot of that you can wrap into a migration, but some of it you might just find to be more efficient to handle later, or maybe you don't have the time or the resources to handle it during the migration. Doesn't mean that you can't plan to handle it immediately afterwards, or later at a more convenient time. You don't want to lose that information or lose track of it if you do want to do a fast follow with it. So there's room in the process to run with that after we run the migration. All right, data and metadata. As you saw on the last slide there, we separate those, when we're going through the process, and that's largely because they require very different expertise and tools, indeed processes, and how you manage them. Chris has a wonderful body of knowledge, and I understand maybe 10% of it. So he gets to do his stuff, and it's quite valuable. And there's a lot of crosstalk between Chris and our developers. So that separation is only skin deep. And as you'll see, our data analysis informs our metadata analysis. It provides context for that and also the raw materials for it. But in the end, we bring it all together to form the migration, both in our sample data that we'll be running and the actual code. So the data prep. This is broken up into 4 parts. First part here is the data survey, where we get a broad understanding of everything, really, just the lay of the land. And then the map to modern Islandora, where we actually take all the various parts and figure out where they're going to go. So in an Islandora 7 migration, you might think of your data streams. They're going to be becoming media, figuring out what the media use of the data streams are, what type of files and media these will be going into. That's what happens there. And then we create sample data. When you're doing development, it's pretty unruly to run with terabytes of data on your local machine. So we pare that down to a thoroughly representative set of data. And we also extract sample metadata. Now, in just about every case we've done so far, we've been able to extract all of the metadata and provide that to Chris and allow his tools to take it from there. But identifying what the metadata is, most cases in Islandora 7 were mods, but there's definitely quite a few others out there. EACPF, which I probably get that acronym wrong, so please forgive me. So figuring out what metadata is there and then providing it to Chris is what we're doing at that stage. So during the data survey, we're trying to answer several questions. Where is the data? What kind of files? The size of the files and the size of the data set. Even in moving from Islandora 7, we're still getting surprises about what kinds of files are in there. It's really quite flexible. Anything that exists could be there. Understanding access restrictions. That's one that, as organizations grow and change over time, it may no longer be clear why there was access restrictions on various pieces, or maybe the access restrictions are out of date. So we're tending to see a lot of discovery here and back and forth with our data owners. Understanding how we'll get the data out. With moving from Legacy Islandora, that's pretty clear, but it's still a question we like to ask. And what form is the metadata in? Like I was saying before, it's mostly mods coming from Legacy Islandora, but it doesn't have to only be that. So when we first started doing this, we were having folks running into the system and running queries based on what they knew they needed to know. But these days we've figured out what we need to know and we've started scripting them. So this process is taking a lot less time than it once did, and will only get further automated and quicker to complete. And some of those scripts are available in the DGI Migrate Git repo. So mapping to modern Islandora. There's a few questions we ask as we take a look there. Whether or not there are data types that aren't supported yet, that's the most key one we found. But just because a data type isn't supported in modern Islandora doesn't mean it can't go in there. It's a bit of a strange term, and maybe I should have picked a different one, because any any files can be put in modern Islandora, just as they were in legacy Islandora. It'll just be different support for viewing, usually. Manually created full text and HOCR files are also a little bit require a little bit extra attention these days. We're not exactly sure how to move those and semantically handle them in the new system, but we have a few workarounds that are good for now. Custom data modeling, as free as things were in legacy Islandora, there's quite a few organizations out there that have custom data modeling, and sometimes that's new content types, and sometimes it's relations that are, well, just ones we haven't seen before, and maybe that stuff belongs in metadata, and maybe it's structural in nature. Kind of figure that out at that point. And the same for malformed data structures. We've seen lots of cases where folks have gone in and manually edited their old Foxmole objects, and sometimes that doesn't go so well. So we have to go in there and get things shipshape again. But we're not just asking these information to design the migration or just for informational purposes. This is the earliest point in the process where we might start doing interventions. And at this point, they've taken the shape of actually going into the old system and changing the shape of the data there to be more in line with expectations and what people are hoping to get at the end of the migration. It's important to understand when you're looking at these things that the earliest point in the process you can take action on a particular issue, usually the less costly it will be, both in developer time, in QA time, and in execution time. So we'll always be looking for those opportunities to have interventions in the data. So yeah, based on the data survey, we would then create the sample data to be used during development. It's pretty important to be using real data. Even if you have 100 files that have the same MIME type, there's always going to be something interesting in the source data from a particular organization. And for smaller migrations, say, I don't know, up to a few thousand items, we might be able to use the entire sample set during development. And then extracting sample metadata, I think I already spoke to this a little earlier, so I'll keep it short. It'll be used by our metadata experts, and we've been able to use the entire data set so far in every case. But in the future, that might not always be possible. I'm getting to Metadata Prep. It's a whole section here, and this is what you're going to want to be bothering Chris with. So there's the Metadata Survey, which is much like the data survey, where you're trying to get a broad understanding of what's going on. Metadata Analysis, that gets into the nitty-gritty about every single field. We create an example metadata set out of there from the understanding of the survey and the analysis. And we then map it to modern Islandora, much like we were in the data prep stage. At this point, I'd like to talk about our master metadata spreadsheet. This is an artifact that Chris has pioneered for us. It's really the entire metadata profile. It has your fields in there, it has your forms, your search criteria, and the migration mapping. There's another link here that once these are public, everyone can take a look at that spreadsheet. It's quite complex, but it's well organized, and it's only that complex because, well, Drupal and migrations are complex. And we start with a starter version of this on each new project that matches our default profile. and I believe Chris is color coding any changes to it to make it easier and faster for developers to understand what changes they actually have to make in the system. So during our metadata survey, there's usually lots of interactions with our data owners. The clients are the experts in their own data. So we start with XPath extraction and quite a few questions that we ask. From a project standpoint, the ones that I'm usually interested in are whether or not there's PIDs or handles of any sort in the system that we'll be recreating or migrating, controlled vocabularies, and what schemas have been or attempted to have been enforced. Then we get into the metadata analysis. This is where we do a deep dive. We start with a gross field analysis where from those XPath extractions we understand the total number of fields we'll be creating and a rough idea of what they are before we dive into each individual one and fine-tune its configuration. Things like cardinality, whether there's 1 or 5 of them, and how long they need to be, whether or not they're dates or numbers or text sort of thing. So I'll keep saying it probably, but especially metadata, this is lots and lots of interaction with your owners here. And Chris has a pretty extensive tool set that he uses for this kind of work. He uses XML to CSV, and he has some custom tooling as well that we're iterating on there. And I'd say this is where over half of the interventions we do during a project come from. You know, metadata normalization is an ongoing bit of work for every organization, I think. And it's pretty attractive to take advantage of this process to clean it up, especially where it'll speed up the actual migration. So once we have a very thorough understanding of the metadata, we create the example metadata set. So this can be a single artificial file that just has an example of every single field, but we often find that insufficient because we want to capture the variability within each field. So we'll often end up with tens of files, which is still pretty manageable, and we'll be using those later here. In general, we've tried to avoid using entire sets here, at least when straight in the development, unless again it's only a few thousand. But it's very, very important that we cover all possible cases of variability within the metadata, largely so we can prepare for writing the transforms, which we'll get into in a moment here. Once we have the sample data there, we'll have a strong enough understanding of the metadata that we'll be able to start mapping it into the fields. So we start with our base profile and our base MMS here, and we define the fields, defining what's going to be going into paragraphs. We use paragraphs to handle hierarchical metadata. And find forms behavior, the search, display, cardinality, and types. Taxonomies are of special interest while we're doing this. They spawn up a little extra migration work where we want to get those populated or decide that they'll be populated during the migration. A fair chunk of the interventions we'll end up doing in the data also come out of this. Just as you get more and more granular into your analysis of the metadata, you'll find more and more things that could benefit from a bit of cleanup. I also want to focus on the cost of post-migration changes to metadata I think Chris mentioned during a previous presentation that to make some modifications to Drupal fields, you actually have to completely recreate them. Delete them, create your new field, you move your data over to it, and then you delete the old one. And we can do that programmatically, but it does require a fair bit of effort. So the more interventions we do sooner in the process, the less costly that the migration will be over time here. So system prep. If you have any questions about this, Luke Sierfelli is the one in the back there. So largely you're worried about your system resources. Do you have enough memory for all of your services? Do you have appropriate computing power? But you're also setting up the Drupal modules and other tooling that you need to support the migration, and preparing access to the source data. So that'll often just, from a systems perspective, be mounting the directories that your old Fedora were on into the new system, so it can access it during the migration. But if you're also transferring from an on-premise install to the cloud or vice versa, actually moving around that data is pretty important to take a look at. You'll often want to co-locate for performance reasons. And then there's optimizations that we perform beyond that. We have 2 modules that we install here that disable some things to make performance of the migration better. So we've got DJI Migrate Image Magic Cleanup, which just prevents temp files from filling up the disk as derivatives are created, because you'll be creating a lot of them. And we've got DJI Migrate Big Set Overrides, which disables solder indexing, content sync, and path aliasing. So all 3 of those can be rather expensive to do piecemeal during your migration, and are very reliable to do post-migration. So migration development, another one with a few steps under it here. First, we combine our sample and example data sets here. We combine our data and our metadata samples into an example data set. We configure the site, which both Chris and Kirsta have given tutorials on during this conference. Then we write our transforms, which is a set of normalizations that we do to make the development go more smoothly. And we actually write the migration, and then we test the migration. So not only was migration development just 1 out of 6 of our top level items, writing the migration is only 4 out of 5 of the items within that. So combining sample and example data set. So earlier, developers retrieved the sample data, and our metadata expert, Chris, there created example metadata. So here we would be taking those 2 things and we'd be combining them so that we could use that to develop and test the migration. So this is where they really come together again. We are working on scripting this process, but I'll be clear that that Fedora and Foxim provide a few challenges in that regard. So configuring the site, the master metadata spreadsheet is a critical tool for this. It really tells the developers in a concise and but still very detailed way how to configure all of the fields, including paragraphs and taxonomies and the ingest forms. Sometimes there'll be search wrapped up in this too, and sometimes that'll be broken out into its own task later, all depending on the scope involved. For a lot of folks, our default search profile is all they are looking for. Then there's write transforms. This can be done in parallel, and it's done by our metadata expert, and we're looking to normalize the data from the source system into a slightly more understood mod structure, and it really reduces the amount of development we have to do. We also clean up data, especially for taxonomies. I think someone mentioned how easy it is for those to get away from you, and EDTF dates, and we test these using our example metadata. So another point of parallelization during this process is that this work can be started before we have combined the data sets with the metadata. Then there's write migration. This can be started but not finished without the first piece there. Developers are taking special attention to taxonomies because they might require their own migration. There's writing the primary migration, which essentially is altering our starter based on the information in the master metadata spreadsheet. With the power of the migrate framework, we get to use lots of existing plugins, lots of work that we've done previously, both in DJI Migrate and things done by the Drupal community further upstream. There's lots of tools at our disposal, and we often write new plugins, often motivated by data cleanup or performance. So our developers got an eye out for when a few extra database queries are going to add a day or so to your migration, and we'll nip those in the bud. So I mentioned the metadata transform earlier. We'd also be incorporating that into the migration at this point, and we'd be testing this during development against the combined data set that we created earlier. And there's testing the migration. You might ask, weren't we already doing that? Yes, during development, but that was with an example data set. And whenever possible, try and use as much data as possible to test your migration. It's a pretty key thing to do. So this tends to be iterative, and we like to test in stage with the largest feasible set of data. In many cases, that's the entire data set, and in a few we haven't been able to do that. And in the few that we haven't been able to, we've been focusing on the node migration. It's really the most complex one. It's where most of the metadata work is going on, and it's important to find as many issues with that as you can as early as possible, so you can have those early, less costly interventions, as we mentioned before. So if at all possible, we try to do dry runs of the entire metadata migration there. So we test in stage because it reduces versions from iteration. If you're running a repo for a decade, you maybe don't want 10 extra versions of the data from the migration just sitting around taking up space and confusing your version history. And it also simplifies iteration because say we need to do one of those large field updates, it's entirely within our tool set to just blow away the stage and start fresh and avoid that work. And then this goes through review, it goes through QA, it goes through review by our metadata expert, and we get our users in at that point, because no one knows the data like the people that own it. So give them a chance to come in and take a look and tell us if we missed anything. So there's some common validation issues that we're running into. And I'm putting EDTF at the top of the list here. But we have a fallback approach that we're prototyping with a client right now. that just kind of recognizes how challenging it is, where we will attempt to well form the data into EVTF and place it into the EVTF fields. But should that fail, instead of blocking the migration or failing validation for the object, we'll take the information as is and place it into another field. So it's there for the owner to come back and change it and have an intervention at their leisure. Another thing that we run across is unexpected multi-valued fields, and we're really focusing there on more stronger early detection of them, and the same with length violations. I'm going to be trying to detect those earlier and prevent them for this stage. And then we get into running the migration. After we have sign off there, we can move to production. So this has several steps in it as well, because we want to make sure that handoff is as smooth as possible. So we run the migration, which is very similar to what we do on stage, but it'll be the entire data set. Then we index Solar and do a few other actions there depending on what the client's needs are and what we disabled to make the migration run more smoothly. And then we have internal sign-off, where we give it one last go around to see if there's anything we can spot. And then another formal round of user acceptance and post-migration system prep, where we clean up the system and do changeover from the old one. So running the migration. So under the hood, the migration is actually around a dozen migrations. It's a bit of a technical detail there, but it's one that gives us power to make changes and fixes while we are running the migration. So if something was wrong with a single one of those dozen migrations, we might be able to target that particular one, make an edit, and rerun it. Or maybe even ideally rerun only those parts of it that we had to make a fix for. So in that way we can do spot fixes and don't have to necessarily worry about either changing, rerunning the entire migration or creating a bespoke data set to make modifications. We'll actually be able to change the code and then run it on the existing migration and it'll update in a very targeted fashion. That's one of the, well, that really helps keep the cost down. So once we've got everything in there, we'll index Solar. At this point we turned that off for performance reasons. Indexing Solar is not necessarily the most fast action, but we're looking at multiprocessing to speed that up. There's a promising Drupal module for that we're looking to adopt. I think it's actually called Fast Solar, something like that. But depending on what we turned off and what the client needs here, we'll also be doing content sync and path alias updates in a similar fashion. You know, all those things that we've turned off to keep the migration fast. Then we have internal sign-off. Here we're doing review, QA, our metadata experts, our primary developer on the project, and a project manager all get a chance to go in there and see if they can spot anything that might be awry. It's important to understand at this point that derivatives may still be underway. We're currently working on bringing derivatives over from legacy Islandora, but you know, there's not always a one-to-one mapping there. So derivatives might still be underway and the site might be slow while we're doing our testing here. And really by this point in time, we should be down to around 2% of the interventions from the entire project. Can't say if we've met that target so far, I've been more around 5 or so, I think. But we'll get there. And then we have our user acceptance, where we walk the client through a demo of the site and then give them some time to review it. And definitely recognize that there might be quite a few stakeholders on their side that would want to get their hands into it before sign off. But after we have user acceptance, we do our post-migration system prep. Because migrations are so resource intensive, we'll probably stand down a lot of that extra resourcing and unmount any source data. This is the point also where we'd be doing any cutting over and decommissioning your legacy site. Lots of folks want to keep the DNS from the old one. And this migration cleanup. I mentioned earlier that there might be something you find along the way that you don't want to address during the migration, but you want to tackle as a fast follow. So this is where you'd be doing that. So future improvements, and I might have mentioned a few of these along the way, but we're looking deeply into multi-processing. We've prototyped that with the client, and I'd say the future goal of this would be to be able to migrate millions of objects in weeks. And it's seeming obtainable. Requires quite the server though. And the DevOps work there has been very interesting, and if anyone wants to know more about that, I'll point you in the direction of Luke. We're also looking into automation at just about every step of the process. Some of that's already been underway, where we're using scripts to query legacy Islandora. Automation is turning into a bit of a loaded term these days. We might be a little more comfortable with it as developers at times. I just want to be clear that this wouldn't be replacing anyone in the process. It would just help them to work more efficiently and take away some of the more repetitive tasks. And the one that I'm most interested in is actually using the information we get from our metadata analysis to define configuration for our fields. And then from that, use that information to define how they'll be migrated. We can develop this in a stepwise fashion and really reduce the cost of migrations, which I think is really key with where Islandora is going right now. I think we're looking at hundreds of migrations in the next few years here, and no one's team is large enough, I think, to pull it off, and how fast we're doing it right now. Another thing we've prototyped is leaving files where they're found. Drupal is a highly extensible framework, and moving all your primary files and all the derivatives from system to system can be very costly. So if you can leave them in place and just reference them from Drupal, which is a thing that is possible with all of the fly system integrations and so on, it'll really reduce the cost of the computational cost of the migrations. So I was hoping we all could have a discussion. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I'm definitely interested in what sort of challenges folks have had in their migrations.
Just curious, in terms of source, what's the most interesting or challenging source that you've had to migrate data out of?
With this process, we've only done Fedora 3s.
Can you repeat the question for the mic?
Oh, sorry. Was asked how, what was the most interesting source system we've been migrating from. And with this process, we've only been coming from Fedora 3. And it stays interesting. And we generally drive right down into the source information there. We found various points that the triple store or solar can be unreliable in the information that we get from them. So we're often parsing Voximil directly, looking at the files directly inside the Krubra structure. Yes?
How do you manage objects that have exact policies or other kinds of restrictions associated? Please repeat the question.
So it was asked there, how do we manage objects with XACML policies? And honestly, that could be its own presentation. Access control is very complicated and a large subject. Right now, it kind of depends on what the intent of the XACML was. In the legacy system, XACML was used for just about all access control. And because it was so flexible and powerful. In modern system, we have more than one way to restrict access. And some of those aren't quite as mature as they could be yet. Everything's always a work in progress. So one of the most common things has been embargoes enforcing XACML. And those we have the new embargo module that was just made public very recently. And we haven't done a migration directly into them, though we are preparing to do one. And the plan there is just to wrap them right into the current migration process, where the entities required would be created by the migrate framework. And it would just create the embargoes in the new system. But that's not the only kind of access control that was in XACML. Is there a particular kind that interests you?
Just curious.
Does anyone have anything else?
One of the issues we ran into was indexing large sets of solar. When you try to index, let's say 20,000, it fails half, and then we had to do like 5,000 each a couple of times. Have you run into those type of issues?
So what was asked was about solar indexing. Been experienced some problems where indexing large sets, some of them might fail and have to re-index again. Is that right?
Re-index in small batches, say 5,000 each, something like that.
So there would be re-indexing of small batches. Did that make it more reliable?
It finishes, but you have to do it, manually a couple of times. So like you have to sit there, divide it up, and then see when it finishes, and go ahead, re-index it again. Sort of.
So breaking up piecemeal was letting you find where was making the redos smaller and more doable. So we've been using the command line drush commands to do re-indexing so far, and we haven't had any troubles as far as I know with reliability of that. We've been running them in screens in situ. And I think just making sure that there's enough resources on the machine, those have been fine for us. But we're also looking at another Drupal module that parallelizes that a bit. And I'll dig up a link for you after this, and that might help you a bit. Anyone else? Yes.
You mentioned that migrating existing derivatives is something that you're working on, and that there are some challenges there. What exactly is the state of that problem?
I'm literally watching something do it right now. Against 3.7 million objects, and times that by ever having derivatives.
So what was asked there was about migrating derivatives and the state of the art on that. And Luke piped up with, he's watching it happen right in front of him right now on the migration we're running.
So what's the challenge there exactly?
Well, it's your first time doing it against insanely big data set. Like you take 3.7 million objects, how many data streams are in each object? Like 20 million, 40 million things. Like it just, so yeah, it just, you know, how to do it scale.
So Luke mentioned scale, which is exactly what I would expect our CTO and the best sys I've worked with speak about. But as a developer, I'll offer another perspective. Derivatives in the old system could be base 64 encoded files within XML. Honestly, the variability there is pretty extreme. So what we've had to do is create a file system adapter that understands those things and can present them as if they are files to Drupal. And that's been written and has been prototyped in our migrations for this one client, and we look forward to rolling it out in other situations. But I'd say that it's there. It's just we haven't finished that migration, so I'd always hesitate to say that it's complete. Go ahead.
It looks like you guys use the Drupal migrate tooling, right? Have you considered Island Workbench, and would you maybe say what's the pros and cons of, let's say, using Drupal migrate versus the Island Workbench?
Yeah, so the question was where we're using Drupal migrate and pros and cons there between migrate and Workbench, and would we consider using Workbench? We are using Drupal migrate there, and I do think it is a very good fit for our needs and our clients' needs. We have a team that understands that technology and can work with it very effectively. I don't think that we ourselves are going to be using Workbench for migrations. It's a wonderful and powerful tool. I especially think our clients will find use of it in batch editing of metadata over time. I think it really shines in that use case. But when it comes to these very large migrations that we're using, I think we've got the right tool for that with Drupal migrate. Anybody else?
I was gonna say, if we've got a minute, I'd love to show the insane spreadsheet that we're sharing.
Why don't you come up?
Okay. While he's doing that, I have a question. Oh, geez, I might have just lost my train of thought.
Sorry if I didn't see out the corner of my eye.
No, give me 1 second. I don't know, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, you mentioned that you've sort of found an emerging community of Drupal migrate experts. Do they kind of congregate on Slack and share tips, or, because I've always found it very difficult because when you encounter like slightly outdated answers to questions on Drupal.org of like, you know, what's the way you migrate into a paragraph and that kind of thing, and it was always very difficult to know like what the canonical updated sort of, you know, toolkit for using migrate is. So like, where does that community hang out, and where do they sort of post to?
Well, there's probably someone I can reach out to get a better answer for you. But there are some Slack channels, I think, on Drupal's Slack that might help. I'm afraid that the folks that I know are very loosely knit and pretty heads down with the work. I'm not sure the community's well formed there, I'm afraid.
That's what it felt like. Thanks.
They're all on IRC.
Possibly.
Sorry, I just wanted to, we just decided to put this up in an available space, so I wanted to share it, especially because it is, in some ways, like the notebooks from 7. in that this is a spreadsheet trying to include every possible bit of information. Come on. And this is also a tool that's very much tooled for our migration process. So it is shared as an example that people can look at, but it has a lot of information that would only be appropriate to our processes. So it is basically, after doing various analyses and getting my list of XPaths for the current metadata, lining those up with the Islandora, the new Islandora fields, marking which ones we're going to be creating and what not, recording of field names. There is space to record how often a XPath appears in the client's data, linking the specific taxonomies, especially noting if we're creating any unique taxonomies, and then a variety of columns with check marks to point out these are the fields of our default that are being used. These are administrative fields, these are new fields. I got everything here. The definition of the field as it is in the current site, the Drupal field type, whether they're required or repeatable, their space on the display and on the metadata form, whether you're creating referenced entities, and then various search and facet information. And the idea is that I'm recording everything here that, to keep track of the decisions that I've made with the client, but also all the things that the developers will have to make some sort of configuration change about. And then there are a series of tabs, like this one is the content type tab, that will copy all the information from that first tab over here that is specific to this task. So, using Google Sheets filters, it copies over the fields and the machine names and the taxonomies, and then the basic information that you would need for the content type, or the basic information for any of the taxonomies, metadata display, metadata form, the migration configuration, which is specific to us, our specific spreadsheet ingest process, the OAI PMH, the Solar, as well as the changes, tracking the changes that I'm going to be adding into the transform. And then just so that this could be a central repository of information I need, as well as something that we could potentially share with a client, there are tabs with all of the controlled vocabularies that come built in on our default site, which makes it real easy to quickly check if, okay, no, we need to add an authority here, or we need to add a term to their list of resource types or something like that. So yeah, we've put this up, it's available, you can make a copy of it if you are at all interested. But like I say, it has our full list of metadata fields, which could also be of use if you're interested. But it's just one way of tracking all of that information so that it's in a central location, and then the developers just go to that when they need to find the things out. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't stress enough how useful this spreadsheet has been for our team. Lots of kudos to Chris there. Did anyone else have something like that? Okay, I guess we're done.